Hello, hello. We are live. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. My name is Olivia Candosia. Brandon Tesslers is in the bathroom right now. He'll be here shortly. Brandon is a licensed therapist. I'm an intern at Effective Artistry, which is in Northbrook, Illinois. We offer all sorts of services here, individual, couples, marriage, and group counseling. And this is not therapy for many reasons. One is that because we're live and people can see your comments, and so that's just something to be aware of. But we are here to just talk about anything and everything. We welcome y'all to interrupt. Nothing is staying on topic. Staying on topic is going where you want to go. And we're just trying our best before you comment to figure out what we think you might be interested in hearing about or talk about things that are on our minds. Just a heads up, we are streaming on 3 different platforms: Facebook, YouTube, and Discord. I believe that's what it is. And so you will only see the comments that are from that individual thing. So we will be reading comments out loud. And yes, I'm an intern here. I'm almost done, and I will be working here in the fall full-time. So that is an exciting prospect for me to be looking forward to. Another exciting thing for me right now is I got accepted to interview incoming counseling students this Friday to see if they'd be a good fit for the program and the profession, which I remember sitting as a student 3 years ago or so and thinking, oh my gosh, I want to do this one day. I want to be one of those students. And it's really exciting to be on the other side and be that person. I remember in the interview process, they're like testing your like social emotional skills and things. And I remember I got asked a random question about when is a hard time in your life? And I started crying, talking about how every moment in my life has been a hard time and confusing. And I remember after that interview process, I went to bed and I just Googled, do therapists cry? Because I was so convinced that I blew it and that I wasn't going to get offered a spot in the graduate school. But lo and behold, I made it and I'm here. And yes, therapists do cry. And I cry often. And I am learning more and more about when that tends to pop up, but starting to feel less embarrassed about it the more and more I work through it and talk about it. But I always think that's so funny that I was so scared that because I showed my emotions in a counseling interview that I would not get in. Fascinating little journeys. It just kind of makes me think about interviews and how, hey, if it's the right place, they will let you in with open arms. And a lot of advice I give for interviews is like, just be yourself. And I think about that with clients too, of like, if it's not a good fit, it's not a good fit. That doesn't mean something's wrong with you. It just means it's not a good fit. And that's totally A-okay. So that's just a little side note that I've been thinking about. Yeah. And I don't know what else. It's always, I bet Brandon's actually challenging me right now to stay here and talk a little longer on my own. I hear noise, and here he is.
Hello.
Hello, welcome.
Sorry about that.
It's all good.
Contact was like folded over in half in my eye. We've started everything.
We've started everything. I started rambling about some stuff.
Great, what were you talking about?
I was talking about how I'm doing this thing on Friday to interview prospective counseling students, and how 3 years ago I was watching those students and being like, oh my God, I can't wait to I want to do this one day. And I was thinking about how they asked me a random question in that interview of like, what's a time in your life you were uncertain about things? And I started crying and I'm like, every part of my life has felt uncertain. And then I went to bed and I Googled, do therapists cry? And I was like convinced that I didn't get it.
You went to bed and Googled it?
I went into my bed and I Googled on my phone, do therapist
because it was an
cry.
online interview.
Because it was a Zoom interview. Yeah. And then it was nighttime, and I was like, wow, you ruined that, Olivia. You cried, you showed your emotions in a thing where they're testing to see your social emotional intelligence. And yeah.
And how did it work out?
And then it turned out great. And I was kind of talking about how we talk about that with clients too, if it's a good fit or not, like that's okay. It doesn't have anything to do with like you being a bad person or not. I don't know.
Well, that's true.
It made me think of that a little bit.
And that's great. It's just interesting that you jumped to that, I guess, instead of, because you were talking at first about like as though this is a good or a bad thing for a therapist or a potential
Sure.
therapist to do,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
But you jump to like, well, if they think it's a bad thing, then that means it's a bad fit.
Oh,
between
I
me
did
and
talk
them.
about how it wasn't a bad thing too.
Oh,
I
sure.
didn't-
Just
yeah,
what
but
you're
I hear
saying
you.
now.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's. It is interesting to me
Mm-hmm.
that our culture has a very clear narrative that emotion is bad.
Mhm.
Like any emotion is bad. And there are intrinsic reasons that people might like come to that conclusion because intense emotional experiences are unpleasant. Even pleasant emotions like joy and excitement and whatever, if they are too intense, too much of your experience is now about the excitement you're feeling. There's a fun fancy term, biphasic. That things have a biphasic effect, meaning that something helps with something and more of it helps more and more of it helps more and more of it helps more, but you get to a certain threshold and now it loses all the benefit and in fact flips over into being bad, like makes the initial thing worse.
Yeah.
So like marijuana use with depression is one of these that like, according to research, marijuana use helps with depressive symptoms and a little more helps a little more and a little more helps a little more. But then you hit a certain point where at this point now it's not helping anymore. And in fact, it's actually making the depressive symptoms worse than no weed at all.
Mm-hmm.
That emotion is like that.
Yeah, I think about when I graduated college and I did the Illinois Shakespeare Festival as an intern there. And it was a great experience. It was so magical, but it was so scary of like what was coming next because I didn't know what was coming next. And I remember driving home feeling so joyful about the experience I had. But then I started to go into a panic of like, oh, but you're not going to feel this joy for that much longer. And it was a weird like.
Yeah, that'll happen. Like everybody, well, maybe not everybody, but it's a common experience. Like if you're on a vacation, for example, that you're enjoying yourself so much. And then at a certain point, like as you're enjoying yourself, you're like, well, but it's only going to last for so much longer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not what I was talking about, but that is a
That's
very common thing that happens for sure. I was talking about literally just get too excited and all of a sudden you can't breathe, like it's literally just,
Sure.
Or like, it can happen with like physical things. Like if you're getting a massage and you feel good about it, whatever, but then it can get too much and then it's ticklish or whatever,
Yeah.
The
Literally.
things which are pleasant, if you then have a certain intensity of pleasure, now flips over to discomfort or pain. Anyway, I was just saying that there are inherent reasons for people to come to the conclusion that like, I want to be careful about emotions because too much can cause a problem. But our culture has like taken that further and make it about like any emotion is bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny to me that like even at this point in time where everyone would say generally that we've destigmatized therapy or mental health care or the terms that they would use, or at least reduce that stigma to a great amount. Like, no, still, even the people who are therapists or are training to become therapists or whatever are still like, well, crying's bad though. I should never cry. I genuinely think if you asked like successful, experienced, professional therapists, is it okay to cry in a session or not? You would still get a significant percentage of those people saying no. Like therapists should not cry in a session. Just funny. Anything less than perfect can trigger shame. Everyone else seems happy. Yeah, well, there's a concept I try to share that, like, to me is very simple, but I have a hard time. My experience has been that I communicate it in ways that I think are clear and simple, but it still doesn't come across, which is when thinking about like when evaluating something, it is best to use like a positive, a neutral, and a negative scale. Meaning like by evaluate I mean assigning value to, right? Like what the word kind of more literally means, like determining how much value something has. That there's positive value and negative value, right? Like when we say value, what we're talking about is like how impactful is something. And things can be very impactful in a positive or pleasant or desirable way, preferable way, or very impactful in an undesirable way, or not impactful at all, which is the neutral case. So just as a default thing, if we were to think about like happiness, people have a tendency to think about this, even if they don't assign these numbers to it, the concept is like, a spectrum, and on this side is like not happy and this side is happy, right? So if someone were to ask you at any point, like, how happy are you? Use numbers, use a scale. People would generally think of like, well, 10 is the maximum happiness and 0 is the minimum happiness, or 1 is the minimum happiness. So just as a general thing, it's better to do 10 is the maximum of the desirable thing, down to 0, which is now neutral, down to negative 10, which is the maximum of the opposite of whatever the desirable thing is. Because what happens is this, what you're talking about, less than perfect can trigger shame, everyone else seems happy. What happens is, let's use a very common example, especially for therapists, but just for people generally. If I am helping someone or trying to help someone or whatever, and then later on I have reason to believe, or I think, I come to the conclusion that like, oh, you know what, I didn't help. There was this thing I could have helped with that I didn't help with. Then I am less than maximally helpful. If we're using this like scale, we could say, I thought I had helped at a 10. I thought I had done perfect. Now I'm thinking I could have done this, or if I had done that, it would have been better, or whatever. So now I'm thinking it was only a 7. But what ends up happening is people put the 10 as the default. So doing a 7, I'm actually interpreting that as a negative 3. That like, quite literally, both with therapists and clients and just people, I have heard people in many, many instances refer to themselves as having harmed or potentially harmed someone by failing to help them. But like helping a 7 out of 10 is not the same as harming 3. I know it's absurd to put these numbers on it, but there's a reason that like negative numbers aren't real, right? You can't observe, there's nothing in reality that here's negative 3 of that thing. It's a purely conceptual thing. But it's a really useful thing to have conceptually for all kinds of reasons. There are all kinds of things that we would have a hard time doing if we couldn't conceptualize negative numbers.
I'm like just realizing that that's true.
Well, because I guess I was going to say we've all, but maybe I should be more careful about. But we've all grown up with an awareness of negative numbers, generally speaking. In the same way that, like, for the most part, everybody here, this isn't everybody in the world, but, everybody who's at this stream, we all know how to read and learned to read at a young age. And so we forget about the fact that, like, this stuff is really new for humans to be able to conceptualize and really valuable, but really different. Like, we're living very differently, thinking and feeling very differently than humans have until very recently. Negative numbers is a like easy way to make the point that to be aware of something which is not present is difficult. It doesn't happen automatically to think about what could be but isn't. But we all at this point have been doing it so long, our whole lives, that we do it all the time. We are thinking all the time about things that don't exist. Yeah. And because humans and cognition, all that stuff is not like that, that's not something we are built to do a lot. What ends up happening is that we're responding to the things we're thinking about as though they are real, as though they exist. Like you just said, I know of negative numbers. It never occurred to me that they're not real things until just now. So like a very common version of this is hypothetical situations, or like if I had only just blah, 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 then yada, yada. Like, nope, that didn't happen.
Mhm.
It's not to say that the logic isn't sound and that, like, we wouldn't reasonably conclude that if you had done this thing, then this thing would have happened. But we don't know that, and we'll never know that because that's not real and it didn't happen.
I think I've heard you say that to me many times.
Yeah.
Or something of the like, yeah.
So, like, like perfection, anything that is less than perfect. Perfection is not a thing. It's not real. It cannot be observed. There's nothing that any person could ever do unless you're putting very limited constraints on it where we could say perfect, right? Like we could say you got a perfect score on the test because you got the maximum score possible, but that's an artificially constrained thing.
Mhm.
In real life, like happiness, for instance, because that statement there, anything less than perfect can trigger shame, quote, everyone else seems happy, meaning anything less than perfect happiness can trigger shame. I am not perfectly happy and I think everybody else is. These kinds of things, perfect is not real. It's not possible. There is no level of happiness you could experience at which you couldn't say, well, it could theoretically be possible to be even happier than this. Or even that you could say, it's theoretically possible that everybody else is happier than this. But you don't know that. Key here, shame, right? If I'm ashamed, generally, if a person is ashamed of something, that's something that they most often put resources towards preventing other people from knowing about, deliberately try to hide it. Even if somebody is trying to make the claim that, like, no, I don't try to hide things I'm ashamed of, which would be, people could say that and it would be absolutely accurate. They just mean a particular thing by shame there, because kind of baked into what we typically mean with shame is I don't want people to know about it. Mm-hmm. But even if you were going to make that claim, you could at the very least say, like, nobody's going out of their way. Nobody's spending resources trying to make other people aware of it. You might not be trying to hide it, at least consciously, but you're not consciously trying to promote it either. So if you are less than perfectly happy and you're ashamed of that, then you are not trying to give anybody the impression that you are less than perfectly happy. Mm-hmm. The logical assumption would be that anyone else who is also less than perfectly happy would be trying to come across as though they are perfectly happy anyway. Mm. But the logic here is, well, everyone else seems happy and therefore they must be, whereas I seem happy to others, but I know I'm not because I'm just pretending or forcing it. Well, why would you not assume that other people are doing the same thing? Mm-hmm. In fact, someone who is legitimately happy, well, let's say perfectly, that's not real, but like, happy as much as a person can reasonably be, is that person likely to be doing anything to attempt to communicate that state of happiness to anybody else? If I am perfectly content, mm-hmm. do I want to go tell people about that? I mean, why would I do anything that takes resources if I'm perfectly content and happy? Why would I go do something unless there's some function that it serves? Maybe I'm telling people because I want to help them. I want to show them how happy I am so that I can, gain credibility and be like, so if you do this and this, it'll work for you too. Or maybe I'm not happy and I'm ashamed of it and I'm trying to give everyone the impression that I'm happy because I'm trying to hide the fact that I'm not happy. Mm-hmm. Happy people generally don't talk a lot about how happy they are or are not. So that's not a thing. Being perfectly happy is not a thing, but as long as I think that it is, I will feel bad about being anything different. So now I'm an 8 out of 10 happiness, but instead I feel like I'm a -2. Mm-hmm. What's wrong with me? Because I'm 2 away from what I should be. It's kind of, this is an example, but also a big part of how we all have ended up this way too. Not the only thing by any means, is how you're supposed to get an A. And anything less than that is just how far off you are from doing what you should have done, which is not how grades started, but it is how they became.
How did grades start? I also love getting a B. I'm like, great. Fine by me.
Yes. As long as you don't think that B is actually reflective of your mastery of the content.
Oh, I know it isn't.
you don't mind getting a B as long as you know, like, but my actual knowledge and ability is A, worthy. It's just this assignment got to be.
Or I'm even surprised, like, really? That, because I feel like I didn't put, or I thought I didn't put like much effort in that at all.
Exactly. You're fine with getting a B as long as you're thinking about it as like, how hard did I try? You're not fine with getting a B if you think of it as, no, I tried the hardest I could try. I did my absolute best and it got a B. That you don't like.
Maybe, probably. I think senior year, Brandon, I'm just coasting.
Yes. What's that about?
Oh, not putting as much effort
Not trying
in.
as hard as you were trying.
Yeah.
This plays into like terms like potential and capacity and intelligence and all that stuff where it's like we're talking, everybody knows that the result that is generated is there are multiple variables that play into that, and we can create abstract categories of things, again, not real, but we're creating a label to encompass a certain whatever. And at the very least, we could take that down to like, what did a person do versus what could a person theoretically have done if they spent more resources on it than they did.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we're thinking about stuff that's not real, and that's what we're calling potential and whatever. And it's a terrible concept because we then become reliant to some extent. We think getting a B is bad, but what's really bad, like what's worse than getting a B is getting a B if that's the best you could have done.
Mm-hmm.
Like getting a B because like you didn't put in as many resources. If you had put in more resources, then you could have gotten an A. That's not great. We talk about that all the time, motivation and blah, 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 whatever. But it's better, it's preferable to people than the idea that like, no matter how many resources I put, I still would have gotten the B. So we're making people even more reliant on this hypothetical, not real thing.
Mm-hmm.
I could have succeeded. I could have gotten the thing that I think is important and beneficial to get, even though that didn't happen. And that's not me saying you couldn't have or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's just saying that's not a real thing. So we think a lot about them like, well, I got a B, but I could have gotten an A if I tried harder. Very easily transitions into, well, I'm fine. I'm happy enough with my life, but I could be even happier if I tried harder.
Mm-hmm.
And now all of a sudden we're upset with ourselves for not having tried harder.
Mm.
It's just all made up stuff. Anyway, you said, what did it start at? C is the average. In a 5-letter grade, A, B, C, D, F, C is the average.
They ever say why they didn't have E?
I am sure that is a known thing. I don't know it. I'm curious about it, but I don't know. But yeah, no, like that's what grading on a bell curve is that most people get a C. This is called grade inflation or grade bloat sometimes. That like, because there are incentives baked in to getting higher grades, there's all kinds of reasons for people to give higher grades or do the things necessary to earn higher grades or whatever at a disproportionate rate. Mm-hmm. So grades are this really honestly kind of terrible thing where we're using them to actually measure is performance. Just what did you do? But everybody is thinking of them and utilizing them and talking about them and feeling about them as though what we are measuring is capability. What are you capable of doing if you really paid as many resources as you could? Mm-hmm. So we get an F and we think we're dumb, or someone gets an F and we think they're dumb, instead of getting an F and that's a reflection of what you did. Whether what you did earned an F because it was the best you could do, or whether you just didn't do anything, or is irrelevant. We don't think of it that way. We think of them as a measure of worth, but that's not what they literally are. And everyone complains about this more and more over time. Like, oh, kids these days, if they get anything less than an A, like their parents are going to come at you, which is somehow framed as a complaint about the child. Like, oh, these children can't handle getting a B, even though it's the parent that's the one that's coming at you. Mm-hmm. But like, that's what we've set up. You know, what college you go to, which we have taught children. And again, I want to make it sound like every single person has this experience in our country, because it is not the case. But primarily for the people who are going to be here and for like large portions of the population, you are taught from a very young age, it's reinforced all over the place that you going to college is good and not going to college is bad. And that smart and successful people go to college and dumb, unsuccessful people don't go to college. And beyond that, if you're in the category of people who go to college, well, there's some colleges that are like good and some colleges that are bad. You know, better than no college, but like community college, does that even really mean anything or whatever, right? So we're telling people all the time that like what college you go to will dictate how good of a life you have. I gotta do my homework so I can get a good grade, so I can get into a good school, so I can get a good job and have a good life. It's like a thing that people say so much that I could have stopped halfway through and people would finish it that way. So doing your homework then feels like having a good life or not rests on doing your homework. Because of all this stuff, it's about evaluating things that aren't real, meaning not observable, like intelligence and whatever. Intelligence dictates whether you'll be successful and happy or not. Can't observe it, but we look at stuff that we can observe and draw conclusions about a person's intelligence, so if you fail, that means you will be unsuccessful at other things in the future, which is absurd.
I just keep thinking about how College Humor has rebranded to the name Dropout, and how it's because the CEO was a high school dropout, and I just love that kind of.
I can't imagine that's the only reason that they would do something like that.
Sure, but that is one of the reasons, and
Sounds like it's probably the narrative they're presenting of why.
Yes.
I would imagine, if I had to guess.
Please, Brandon. I
would guess that a big part of that change, or at least like what people were talking about in deciding whether to make the change, was I would bet.
Okay, I'm ready.
That they had statistics showing that like the people who viewed their content or went to their website or whatever at a very high rate were college attendees or college graduates, and that people who never went to college didn't often come to their site, and that they had a big conversation about like,
fascinating.
How do we make this clear to people that this isn't just about, it's not just humor about college. I didn't even
put that together that it was college humor before. I really didn't. That's funny.
So labeling as Dropout, well, college people would still think of that as being, and non-college people wouldn't see that and be like, oh, that's not for me. In fact, they might be even more. I don't obviously know. I wasn't in any of these meetings or anything, but I would bet good money that was it. And that like when we then need to offer an explanation for this huge rebrand to everybody, we don't want to get into those details necessarily, but we could just say like, yeah, I'm a dropout.
Right.
I bet though, if you look closely in like whatever written thing that he or she put out there, I would bet that it does say in there that like we wanted to make this more accessible to other people like me
I guarantee
who are dropouts and stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway. So evaluating things which do not exist is fine. It's useful. We do it for a reason.
All the time.
But it's even more useful if you can actually remember and respond to these things as though they aren't real. Everyone else seems happy is a statement anyone can make at any point. I mean, it wouldn't be literal, right? No one would ever say that everyone else.
How do you help someone who can see the logic that that's not true, but still thinks it? Of like.
Well, what do you mean by thinking that statement? They can see the logic that that's not true, but the thought still occurs to them, or they see the logic that that's not true, but they still think that it is true.
It's probably the last one.
Well, if someone thinks that it is true, then they don't see how it could not be true. And for the most part, what that means is things like I was just saying, is if someone's like, everyone else seems happy, and I say, literally everyone? No, not literally everyone, right? Like they could understand that the statement isn't literally true, but the thing I was communicating is still broadly true. So that's why you got to get at like, well, what are you trying to communicate then? What are you saying? You don't actually think everyone else seems happy. So what are you saying?
Yeah.
Like other people seem to be happier than me. All other people? No, some other people.
Who are those people?
Who are those people? Generally, someone with a statement like that would mean like the average person, the normal person. Most people seem happier than me. Okay, seem in what way? As in like you're directly observing them and reading them as happy. Can't be that because you're not seeing like average or normal or most people. So you just mean like if I think about, I think that most people or the average person is happier than I am, which is fine. You can say that.
Mhm.
You can even believe that it is true, but you also can acknowledge that you don't have any data to suggest that that's true. And we can talk about it more, and I can point out all kinds of evidence to suggest that that isn't true in a broad way. Like when I'm sad, safe to assume that the average person is happier than I am in that moment.
I heard Broadway, and I was like, that word, Broadway, interesting.
Yeah, that is a funny, you know why it's called that?
I don't.
In the early days, it literally was just like a very wide road. It was the broad way.
Interesting.
Called Broadway.
Just a Broadway baby. Yeah.
This is part of why I do like etymology and stuff, is to take something which you've always perceived as a single thing and then like break it down into its elements is always a fascinating, like, oh, I never thought.
Yeah.
And it's not that I've never heard the word Broadway. Obviously I've heard it a lot. I just never, I know what broad and way, I mean, you know, just never considered it. So that's part of why I like etymology and just systemic thinking and stuff in general, is to call it systemic.
Oh, systemic.
To call attention to like the things that contributed to the end result that you are aware of. I'm not saying it's different than what you're aware of, but having more awareness of like how it came to be that way does change what you think and feel and do.
Yeah. Lately I've been like walking in a hallway or walking and being like, your name's Olivia. Huh, that is so interesting. People call you that every day. That's actually your name. And that it's just like this. I've thought that before being here, but now I think of like your awareness is, I don't know.
What are you aware of in the fact that your name is Olivia?
I don't know if it's any different than what it was before, but I'm just.
Well, like when you're having these moments where like your name is Olivia, what do you mean?
It's kind of like my existence, like as a kid when you're looking in the mirror at your eyes and you're like, oh my god, I'm a person. What is
this? Is all very abstract. I don't know what you mean. What is interesting about the fact that your name is Olivia? When you think about
people call me that and I've just accepted this.
Yeah, it is your name. That's what the function of it is for people to call you that. Why is that strange to you?
I don't know. Why do you think it is strange to me?
I don't know, but one possibility is that what you're thinking about when you think about this is like, that's just a sound. That's just a word. It's not me.
Yeah.
Like, it's not who I am. It is the name that I am called. It is the sound that is made, the word that is used to refer to me, but it's different than who I am.
And then there have been mornings lately, this is true, where I'll wake up and I'm like, whoa, you're a person. And
I don't know what that is. People use that language a lot, like, oh, being a human, or oh, I'm a person.
And you don't know what that means?
I generally am aware of the reason, the point someone's trying to make in using it.
I think it's like, for a second, I'm not on this autopilot thinking about the decisions I'm making. It's like really being present with like acknowledging that I have a body and a heart and that I will die one day.
Oh, I hate that part.
The death part?
Just the awareness of how finite life is.
Yeah.
It sucks. I mean, we're wired in a way to like not be making decisions all the time as though you get one life and it's, more or less 100 years or whatever, right? And so whenever you think about that, really think about it, that's unpleasant.
Yeah.
But also you make better decisions and do things better as you become more aware of like, there's a later time. There's this thing called later, and it's worth doing some things now that maybe would be less than what I prefer, but because of later payoff.
Yeah. And what's interesting to me is whenever I'll have that death thought where I'll wake up and I'm like, oh my God, like I'll literally say, oh my God, out loud. And every time that happens, it takes me back to the first time I remember that happening to me and running into my parents' bedroom, like freaking out about it. But
freaking out about what?
About dying.
Sorry, you're waking up and saying, oh my God.
I wake up, I'm laying in bed and I'm like, oh my God, you're going to die one day. And then I literally say, oh my God, out loud. I remember as a kid processing that I will die one day and that my parents will die one day and going into their room. And I clock that memory every time, or I think every time.
No, that's fine. Just interesting that you said processing that I will die one day. I don't know what you mean by processing there.
Thinking about, I guess.
Oh, that's what people mean by
Yeah.
it a lot of the time.
Yeah.
It's funny though, because a process has like an end point.
Yeah,
And
there's
so for some reason saying processing, sometimes we like to say processing because it implies like either I resolved it or I worked towards, got closer to
Yeah.
the like resolution.
my resolution is just go to bed.
Instead of just like thinking.
Yeah.
Just thinking about it.
But it's why I'm saying it's interesting is because that is the only time that I'm aware that I think about the first time it happened. Like when I kiss my boyfriend, I don't think about the first time I ever kissed somebody. You know, like I don't think about my firsts often, but that one I always clock as the first time I thought about death.
Those kinds of things are interesting to me, and it's the kind of thing that therapists generally love to run with. Of like, well, let's think about why this comes up for you when this happens and whatever. And it's not that there's never any utility there, but it's certainly not an answerable question.
Yeah.
And part of the reason that people think about questions is because they think it's answerable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I gave you a puzzle and was like, this puzzle cannot be solved, it is not designed in a way that allows it to be solved.
I'd still try and solve it.
No, you probably wouldn't.
No.
If I just took, unless you like thought that was part of the trick, or like I was
Right.
trying to trick you. But if you genuinely thought like, no, this is just a collection of shapes, they don't actually go together to make a star, then why would you try to make a star out of it?
Mhm.
But if I give it to you and say, if you combine these shapes in the right way, they can form a star, then you try and solve it. So like we spend resources trying to do stuff that seems like it will be useful to us,
Mhm.
and things which can't be done can't be useful for the purpose of getting them done. Oh, that was confusing.
No. Say it again.
Things which can't be done cannot be useful for the reason that completing them will be useful. So here's what.
I want to hear the first half again.
Perfection.
Mm-hmm.
And again, unless we're talking about specific constraints of like, do this task in this way,
Mhm.
you can perfectly follow directions because the directions are constrained, if they're specific enough and whatever. But otherwise, it's not a real thing. Like, I want to be the perfect husband. That's not there's no set of observable criteria that we could list out for that. It's not doable.
Mhm.
And it's still better for me to be closer to being a perfect husband than further from it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there are things that are not possible to accomplish,
Mhm.
but that trying to accomplish them is still valuable because getting closer and closer and closer
Sure.
to it, moving in that direction is valuable.
Sure.
And one of the issues with a lot of our culture is that we have eliminated that idea that like, you shouldn't waste your time trying to do something that you cannot do.
Mm.
So we then, like an idea that's been around in various forms for a long, long time, the idea of like striving for perfection is not something we made up,
Mm-hmm.
but it's relatively recent for people to like think of and respond to that idea as though it is possible to be perfect.
Mhm.
Like feeling bad for failing to be perfect is a silly thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's unlikely that humans who were, coming up with this concept would then be like, well, we just made up this abstract word to refer to a not possible thing, but just a way to say that like going that way is better.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, perfect isn't that. Perfect meant complete originally.
Mm.
But, we change it. Kind of like ultimate meant final. But then it makes sense why someone would say like, this is the ultimate showdown, meaning like,
Yeah.
any other thing that happens after this couldn't even be called a showdown because this is the last, like nothing will be a showdown like this. This is the last. But that you say that enough and then it just becomes like, this means really cool and important.
I just thought of this ain't my first rodeo, but I don't know how that connects.
This is a funny, not super relevant thing, but penultimate means second to last.
Right. I hate that word.
So many people do.
Yeah.
Because since we don't think of ultimate as last, we just think of it as like super cool, really awesome, whatever.
I always have to Google when they're like, this is the penultimate episode.
So anything that adds a prefix onto that,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to make the assumption means even more.
Yeah, definitely.
Like cool, super cool, is
Right.
even more cool.
That's
And
funny.
pen is not a prefix we know. So like penultimate sounds like super ultimate,
Yeah.
like really ultimate. And then to find out it kind of means the opposite of that,
Right.
but not really the opposite. So it's not like I got the wrong, like I didn't go in the wrong direction. It's just a completely different thing. It really sticks in people's minds. So like so many people know penultimate.
It's so aggravating.
It's just
when I'm like, oh, it's the season
like,
finale tonight. People are like, no, this is the second to last episode, Olivia. I'm like, oh.
I remember, I have a specific memory of somebody using the word penultimate, a teacher in one of my classes saying like, it's the penultimate, whatever, and then catching themselves and being like, no, that means second to last. I don't know why I would have said it. It's not the second to last. It's just the most important, like corrected themselves.
They said it's the most important?
Right. What they were trying to communicate is that this thing they were talking about is the most important thing.
But they said penultimate.
They said penultimate and then immediately caught themselves. I mean, no, I didn't mean that. I meant it's.
I don't like that.
Because so many people use it that way.
Yeah.
There's so many. This is how language evolves, right? Like belligerent.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean, or originally didn't mean very drunk, but that's the more common use of it now. It meant like looking for a fight, trying to start a fight, being ready for a fight.
I can see that word on my flashcard.
And you can imagine circumstances in which someone would say like, that person's so belligerent at a time where they are looking to start a fight or whatever, and they're also very drunk. And then someone else hears that without knowing what the word is and just thinks that they're referring to that being them being really drunk. And so then uses that word to mean really drunk, and then it gets on from there. Although it is still always used generally to mean really drunk in a very like rowdy way. Not necessarily looking for a fight, but in like a problematic, rowdy way.
Yeah.
But at this point, if you were to say someone was being belligerent without them having been very drunk, most people would be confused by that.
Yeah. I pictured tables getting knocked over and big arms.
So language evolves, and that's fine. There's not about using language correctly or incorrectly. I'm just saying this idea that because something isn't real, then it shouldn't matter is absurd. All kinds of things that aren't real matter. They're impactful, valuable, important, worth thinking about, useful, whatever. And by having that premise that only if something is real should it matter, it causes all kinds of problems, because then we have to turn all of our like thoughts and feelings and whatever into real things, which they aren't. And I have to give the caveat every time of like, that doesn't mean they don't matter, because otherwise if I say thoughts are not real, then people are generally, or at least there's a high likelihood that people are going to interpret that to mean that I'm saying like they don't matter. Because they've encoded real with whether it matters.
I'm thinking about you saying that doesn't matter to things, and now I'm wondering, like, when does he say that doesn't matter? When have you said that?
I say that all the time.
Yeah. What does not matter?
Don't know. It would depend on here are some reasons that I might say.
Okay, great.
And to be clear, one of the things I'm trying to reinforce is nothing I'm saying at any point ever has been about here's the good way to use language and here's the bad way to use language. Like I can be aware that belligerent originally meant this other thing, but if I try to use it that way, like it's just going to be poor communication. So language is about the impact that you're trying to have on somebody in a moment. And if I'm saying to somebody that something doesn't matter, what I'm trying to do is call their attention away from that to something else. Most likely. There might be times where I'm doing other things by saying that.
No, that clocks.
A lot of the time it's about calling a person's attention to the fact that they are treating something as though it matters. And I want them to pay attention to the fact that they're treating it that way. But other times it's just, no, I don't want to talk about this. Let's move on to another thing. It's not that it never matters under any context, but it is not relevant to what we're doing right now, or it's not worth taking the time and resources to do that right now.
Language.
Oh, sometimes, I don't know if this was already encapsulated in what I said, but sometimes what I'm doing when I say something like that is like we're tracking a person's meanings, like how they've connected A to B to C to D. And I've identified that I think it would be helpful or useful to like change it so that A goes to B goes to C, and it's a flow chart where it can go to D, but it could also go to E instead. And in order to try and like get that other option in, I'm pointing out that D is not relevant here. This is like little abstract and whatever, but like
I
you don't unlearn things. You don't
think you do
break
that to me all the time. You're
connections.
like, let's point the arrow here.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
every conclusion a person has drawn, they've drawn for a reason, and it was useful to them in some way at some point.
Mm.
So if we were, it's not even possible, but if we were to try to say, you shouldn't make that connection that you have made, at best, what we could actually accomplish is making the person feel badly when they make that connection or when they recognize that they make that connection.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
At best, we can make them feel bad.
You can't break a connection that someone has made.
Mm-hmm.
If I learn that like dogs are pets,
Mhm.
and then you're trying to teach me about like wild dogs or whatever, that not all dogs are
Mhm.
pets or whatever, there's not a way for me to unlearn that dogs are pets.
Right.
But you can add in this new option that sometimes a dog is not a pet.
Accommodate.
And that's a bad example for the most extreme version because sometimes there are conclusions that we draw that aren't identifiably accurate.
Mhm.
What's an example of something that someone would believe, like a connection that's made that like this is this or this means that, where we could like logically definitively say like that is not accurate.
I mean, oftentimes when I'm dressed in a nice dress, people say, "Oh, you must be going somewhere nice today." Does that work?
No, we're looking.
Darn.
What I'm trying to find right now specifically is a connection that could never be true.
Oh, okay.
That like in all cases this is an untrue thing.
Oh, I don't know.
Well, whatever. I'm having a hard time coming up with one, which my initial assumption always, whenever I'm trying or working with someone and we're trying to come up with a specific example or like an observed experience and we can't, I immediately then I'm going to default to assuming that it doesn't ever happen. That doesn't mean that it doesn't. I'm aware I might not just be aware of it or can't remember it or it happens, but not in my experience or whatever. But if I have a lack of any evidence, I should assume it doesn't happen until I get evidence that it does.
A thing that
So like
be true.
what I'm about to say is not one that cannot be true because I can't think of one that can't be
Right.
true in this moment. So maybe they don't exist. But the point I was going to make is that even if there was one that couldn't be true, it still could be useful to believe and act and
Sure.
whatever as though it was true. It must have been, or it never would have been encoded.
Mhm.
And so in trying to break that by saying, well, this is not true, we're conflating two things, whether something is true and whether it's useful, which is back to whether it's real and whether it's worth doing or important or meaningful. They're like, if I believe something which isn't true, but in believing that I then like do things that are useful and valuable to do, then why does it matter whether the belief itself is true or not?
When you say real, can you define what that means?
Observable. It exists. It is composed of matter and or energy. It exists in the observable.
And that's why you say
universe.
thoughts are not real.
Yes. Obviously, like all language, sometimes I use it the ways that other people use it. Sometimes I do that deliberately. I'm trying to communicate something to a person who has used the word real in a particular way. I'm not trying to like reference this other thing. I'm talking about what they're talking about.
Feelings are real because they're observable.
So
Tricky.
thoughts are also observable. That's why I clarified about existing in the physical universe.
Yeah.
Because there's empirical, which is things which are observable by multiple people.
Mhm.
Like I can see that tree, you can also see that tree. That is empirical
Mhm.
information, data, whatever. My thoughts, I observe them. My feelings, I observe them.
Mhm.
But they don't exist. And I'm saying feelings to mean like emotions. Because you could say a feeling, even pain, like you could say there's an electrical signal that is theoretically observable, but no, like I'm the only one that observes the pain. The pain is not observable.
It has to be observable
By
to
others.
others.
So that's why I shifted it to something which exists in the physical universe, is composed of matter or energy. Your thoughts are not composed of matter or energy. And I know people think that like, well, there's electrical energy in my brain when I'm thinking, and that's true, but the electrical energy is not the thought.
I hate it.
We can observe the we can observe the electricity, right? We have tools that allow us to see where electricity is. We're not seeing the thought. That's a different thing. Supervene. That's the word I was trying to think of. Maybe you weren't in that conversation. No, I think it was on the stream.
I don't know. Give me context.
Supervene is the like term in logic for any change in A requires that there was a change in B. A supervenes on B. It doesn't mean that the change in B causes the change in A. We can't make that claim definitively. Just if we observe A and then we observe A a second time and it's different, then we know B would also be different from whatever we observed earlier too. So thought supervenes on cognition, supervenes on physicality.
Okay.
It is not the same thing though. I don't remember if it was on the stream. There was some conversation. I was trying to remember that term and I could not remember it. And it's a really hard one to Google too. So
yeah.
Supervene. I don't know why I just prompted that time. Anyway. Totally off track now. What were we talking about? Oh, thoughts aren't real.
Yeah.
Yes. Again, real just gets interpreted by people as a synonym for important.
Can we talk
meaningful
about the difference between emotion and feeling?
Sure.
Just because I still am so confused.
Okay. As with all these conversations, and this is very important distinction to make, but a tricky one. What we're talking about is how these words are used.
Okay.
What are we using the word to refer to? We're not talking about like there's a categorical thing or whatever, right?
I got nervous that you were going to say I wasn't staying on topic and that the streamers don't want to hear that. I don't know.
That's funny because right before that I was asking what we were talking about, which is unusual. So.
And I usually am like, interrupt, welcome, it doesn't matter. And now
So all we're talking about is what people mean when they say feeling versus what people mean when they say emotion, not some idea of like, it is correct that these are emotions and these are feelings.
That's already helpful.
And emotion is a subset of feeling in the way that we use it. Because I can say like, I feel tired, but generally wouldn't call that an emotion. Or like, I feel cold, or I feel a pinprick in my hand, you know.
Sure.
Whereas emotions, we also use the term feel for that, and that's fine. That's not incorrect. It's just not everything that a person would say is a feeling is an emotion. But
that was
everything
helpful.
a
The
person
umbrella.
would say is an emotion is a feeling.
Great.
What I think is useful, again, not about what's correct or definite, but in terms of like how to think of things in ways that are useful. I think it is useful to talk about emotions as things which include both physical sensation and cognitive experience.
Emotions?
Yes. Mm-hmm. That for a person to have an experience that they label an emotion, there's got to be something in their cognition that they're recognizing paired with something in their physical sensation that they are recognizing. And it's the combination of those things. Like, I get it when I'm very excited. This is a common thing. When I'm very excited, I get a physical sensation right here that feels like, expanding pressure, like a bubble or whatever, like I'm going to burst in my chest, When I get very nervous, that same sensation happens. Whether or not I say that it's excitement or nerves has to do with other things that I'm also clocking in combination with that.
I'm gasping because I thought of like, when I'm really happy, I can feel how big my cheeks are. But also when I'm really sad and I'm crying, I can feel how big my cheeks are.
So it's helpful to talk about like a perceptual set or a schema of things, but that's crazy language. Not crazy. It's just very abstract language. Whenever a person learns what a thing is, kind of like what we're talking about right now, what is an emotion or whatever, the process of learning that involves like you have to point to things. So like that's why initial language development is about language that relates to like physically observable stuff. You learn mom and dog and whatever
colors too
before you're learning concepts of like I'm angry or whatever. Because in order to acquire that language, you have to have the sign, and you have to have the thing to which the sign refers or the impact that it causes, and you have to have like the ability to observe those things in tandem multiple times in order to
Isn't
make
it
that
so fun to
connection.
watch your kids learn to speak?
So fun.
Ah.
Is still.
Yeah.
Nobody ever stops learning to
Yeah.
speak. And yes, it is so
That's
fun.
so cool.
It is also really, here's a parenting thing,
Uh-huh.
or just like an anybody who interacts with children thing.
Mm-hmm.
There is understandably a focus on like teaching children to use language correctly. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're focused on with that is like, if the child is interpreting something in a way that is different than what adults would generally interpret that to mean, adults who speak that language would interpret that to mean, we want to clarify for them what people generally think that it means so that like
Mm-hmm.
they interpret what other people are meaning with more accuracy and they can communicate what they're meaning. So like, I don't know why this is the first thing that popped in my mind is a few weeks back or something, my wife referred to breaking out
Mhm.
as like
Yeah.
blemishes on
Yeah.
the skin. You know, talking to our oldest son about washing his face, because if people don't wash their face, they can break out. And without like registering
Yeah.
that that's not a term he had heard in reference to that before or whatever. So this is just how language acquisition works for everybody. You just talk and then they're
Mhm.
confused by something and either you recognize the confusion or they ask for or whatever. But then I saw that he was responding to that like
Break
in a
it
certain way. I
out.
was like, oh, let me explain what that means. Because what's fascinating to me and the point I'm trying to make is it's so useful to me to treat that as information, valuable feedback and information about how absurd our use of language
Yeah.
is. So it is yes, it is useful and helpful to point out like this is what people mean by that, or this is what that means, or whatever. And then there's this second thing that I think also is very useful that I think people don't do as much because it isn't top priority. So it takes extra resources, which is to be like, that is strange that we use that term in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are relatively like innocent ones like that.
Yeah.
Right. And we can kind of logically just track like why would we refer to that as breaking out because things are breaking through the skin or whatever. But other ones are much more impactful and like meaningful to explore. Like, ooh, that's maybe a problem that I'm using that language
Sure.
to refer to that thing in that way.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, that's a recommendation to all people working with kids is when something you say or that someone says confuses them, help address the confusion and clarify the meaning, but also log that away as like, that's interesting.
Can that look like, oh, I can see why you thought that, like a conversation with the child, or is that just more for you?
Well, that's not what I'm talking about.
Okay.
And that can theoretically be useful, but only if a person's feeling bad for having gotten it wrong. That's
Sure.
what you're thinking about is more likely to be useful for older people who are like, oh, the fact that I didn't interpret that or understand that or whatever makes me feel bad because I'm dumb or whatever. That's where we more likely want to be like, I see why you interpreted it that way. Otherwise, it's not necessarily important or meaningful to communicate to them that you can see why they interpreted it that way.
Even though you're acknowledging like, oh, I clocked that too, child, that like.
Well, so a lot of the time I'm talking about is not that they interpreted it in a different way.
Uh-huh.
So it's not about understanding
Okay.
why they interpreted it that way.
Okay.
It's more about like they didn't know how to interpret that, and the fact that like we're talking about calling someone's attention to something, right? Like I haven't had my attention called to that in a long time, or maybe ever, or whatever, and now paying attention to like that's not an intuitive understanding of how that word or phrase would be used or whatever. How did we come to that? Or I'm not saying all the time, but yeah, being around kids. I'm just thinking about our time, but I don't have 2 o'clock today, so. Okay, I genuinely believe that, and this is not a hot take or controversial opinion, although I'm going to extend it into something that might be.
Okay.
That listening to other humans, not thinking about what they might say or what their experience might be, but actually taking in data that originates with them, even though you then interpret it and whatever. That listening to humans is literally what makes a human a human. a different way to say that would be, is what makes a person sane.
Listening to others.
Yes.
Mhm.
If we theoretically imagine a person who is navigating an environment with a bunch of other humans in it, but everything they're doing and saying and whatever has no relationship to what everybody else is experiencing, seeing, saying, doing, whatever, that's literally what we call insanity. I mean, hallucinations, as an example, if I perceive something and everybody else doesn't, but I'm like, nah, that's real, ignoring the data, that's a hallucination. A hallucination, just to be clear, because people all the time will be like, I think I hallucinated, or I hallucinated whatever, whatever. For it to be a hallucination, you have to have thought that it was actually data that originated outside of you. Like, hearing a voice in your head is not a hallucination. All people, quote unquote, hear a voice in their heads all the time. But if you hear a voice in your head and you think that voice is coming from somewhere else,
Mm-hmm.
like the environment, I heard someone say my name when there was no sound waves in the air. If you believe that it came from external when it didn't, that's what makes it a hallucination.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, if a person's ever saying, like, I think I hallucinated whatever, that can be accurate if what you mean, and like people who are on drugs especially, who are using it this way, where what they mean is, at the time that I was perceiving it, I did believe that it was originating in external data, but now I recognize that it wasn't, so I can refer to it as a hallucination. But if you think something is a hallucination, then it isn't, because you don't think that it's coming, that it's real, that it exists, it's composed of matter and energy. Same with delusion. I think I'm delusional. I was having a delusional thought, whatever. Nope. A delusion is something that you believe is true.
Mm-hmm.
If you think it's delusional, then it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
That one's really important because of certain concepts, like delusions of grandeur. Maybe I'm just delusional thinking that I could succeed at this thing. Like, no, that's not what a delusion is. It's not what a delusion of grandeur is. That's people taking language that was devised for a very specific niche thing, and then that language gets disseminated and applied to things, because most people don't ever have any interactions with the thing that is originally was referred to as a delusion of grandeur. And so when I hear that term and it sticks, and it sounds like people never use the word grandeur, but many people would say delusions of grandeur.
Yeah.
Many people would say that phrase or recognize that phrase that would never say delusion or grandeur in any other context.
Right.
But because the thing that it was originally designed to refer to is not something you ever experienced, you don't assume that, you assume it refers to things that you do experience or hear other people experiencing. Mm-hmm. So then you apply it to things that, but no, it's when a person has a genuine belief in their own grandeur, their own like importance, not about what they could potentially be someday, but like, no, I am the emperor of the world, or I am the second coming of Jesus, or whatever. We can future shift some of that, but only when it is knowably delusional, like, or at least reasonable to determine that it's delusional. Like, I will become the supreme ruler of all mankind. Even if you don't think that you are, we could say that's delusional. If you believe it, like that is a true thought. Mm-hmm. I will be that, not I want to be, or maybe I could be, or whatever. Mm-hmm. That would be problematic in its own ways, but not delusional. Anyway, listening to other people. In philosophy, the thing that I've been referring to today is like the physical universe. There's a term called the shared reality. That what makes something real, the only way an individual human knows that something is real is that other humans also are aware of it, and then we communicate or behave in ways that indicate that we're both aware of it.
Sure. I just thought about how I was talking about, like, oh my God, I feel like a human. And you're like, people always say that. What would you equate that to for you? Like, that experience of...
I don't know what you meant in that case. Do you just mean like, I'm alive?
Yeah, like a real extreme awareness of being alive.
Yeah, just being alive.
Okay.
Because other times when people are like, oh my God, I'm a human, they mean like, I have feelings, or I'm imperfect, or
Sure.
like there's many, many different things that I'm human can refer to. That's why I said in general, I can piece together what
Sure.
a person means by it. Although another point is asking somebody what they mean has utility beyond just, I'm not sure what you're trying to communicate to me. Even if I am sure, like, even if I'm confident that you're trying to communicate this, it can still be useful for me to ask you what you mean, to draw your attention to and have us explore what are you talking about and why are you referring to that as being human.
That's helpful for me as a therapist in training to hear that.
Oh my,
Like, not to ask a question that is presuming, because I was like, well, you know the answer to that question, or you think you do, Olivia.
yeah, that's an ego thing, and it's very common.
Yeah.
But like I try to use this example with some frequency, so you might have heard me say this. That like I might be meeting with somebody and they're like, yeah, I'm really depressed, and I'll say, what do you mean depressed? What do you mean? And sometimes they're like, you're a therapist, you don't know what depressed means. No, I know what depressed means. I know what the term means with the definition. I don't know what you're referring to.
Yeah.
I don't know what is the experience that you've been having that you're labeling as depressed.
Yeah.
So
What do you mean silly?
part of the reason that will happen is, again, because people are so focused on correct and incorrect.
Sure.
So people will often respond if I say, what do you mean by depressed? That their response is like, he's suggesting that I used that term incorrectly.
Mhm.
So, because if I used it correctly, he wouldn't be confused and ask me about it. So he's saying I said something wrong, and then I can respond in that way. Like, no, I didn't use it wrong. What are you talking about?
This comment.
It's funny. I just jumped in, and I've had the song "Being Alive" from Company stuck in my head.
It's what I've been singing in my head since you said being alive.
I like that song, particularly Raul Esparza's performance at the Tonys in, I'm going to say like 2008-ish, somewhere around then, when there was like a brief fad of musical revivals where the actors played instruments on stage to accompany themselves, and they did Company that way. And Raul Esparza played. What's the character's name?
I don't have the characters' names.
It's in that song though, where everybody's like calling him and leaving messages. Oh my gosh. I want to say it's like something like, it's not in Being Alive, but it's in Bobby.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes,
that was going to bother me. And Raul Esparza is great. And so he, at the Tonys that year, did a performance where he like starts out playing the piano and singing and then stands up and sings. I mean, I have a particular passion for musical theater from roughly 2005 to 2009 because that's when I was an undergraduate studying acting. So I was
that makes
very
a lot of
aware
sense.
of, you want to talk about like Avenue Q or Spring Awakening. I could talk about those things.
I cannot stand Spring Awakening.
Interesting.
But that's a whole other like thing to explore.
Why can't you stand it?
I think, to be honest, I think it's because it made me uncomfortable at first, like exploring
The content
a little bit.
Oh yeah, sure.
But
well, that's fair. And I'm not one to be like, no, good art should make people uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And having something that makes you uncomfortable be something that you can't stand, like that's almost synonymous to say that. It's not something to be argued.
And so like there are some songs I really love, but other ones where I'm like, ugh, it just makes me feel icky.
Because of the content.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing about the phrase, like, I can't stand it, does absolutely communicate, like, it makes me uncomfortable, I don't like it. But it is also, like, if a person thought a musical was really terrible, they could say, I can't stand it.
Sure, yes.
So knowing which version.
Yeah.
Again, separate from, are you using it correctly or not, is like, this can be used in different ways. And you know which way you're using it right now.
Yeah.
And the fact that you used it without giving me the information I need to know which way you mean shows me that you didn't even consider that I might not know which way you mean. So asking which way you mean doesn't mean that I didn't get the gist of what you're saying. I did, but I don't know which version of this you mean or why you don't. And that doesn't matter, except if it's interesting. Like if I care about knowing, do you think it's a poorly written musical? Like that musical.
And you know what? I saw a stage production of it where the stage was slanted and like everything was just on like this big ramp. And I hated that. I didn't like the production I saw.
Was that like a deliberate set choice or just how that
It was a deliberate
stage
set
was?
choice.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I could see going for that. I don't know that musical super well, but
Yeah.
given the like the themes that you're
Yeah.
Spring Awakening is a musical based on like a novel, I think, about like children at a boarding school in Germany
Mhm.
at some like, I don't know, 1950, some past period, and strong themes of exploring like going through puberty.
Yeah,
and-
coming of
and
age.
growth. But not
No, it is puberty.
coming
It
of
is.
age tends to communicate to people like becoming an adult, like the transition
Yeah.
from I'm a kid to I'm an adult now, where this is very explicitly about like all of a sudden I have sexual desires
Right.
and whatever, like
Right.
very explicitly about puberty. It's also known for the music was written by Duncan Sheik, who's like a pop rock musician prior to that.
It's this thing of stomping
So-
boots.
At that point, that was still relatively new
Yeah.
to have like a Broadway musical written in the style, like the music is music you could have heard on the radio theoretically.
Yes. I think I also, at that time when it came out, I was making a connection to Leah Michelle and Glee. And I had something about Glee where I was like, well, whatever. But I think now looking back, I would have enjoyed watching Glee.
Oh,
And so,
that's giving me so many thoughts, but not to talk about.
I know.
I want to know about. Let's see. I was a fiddler for Fiddler on the Roof in high school because I was the only person in both orchestra and musical theater. And I wasn't very good at it, but I love those songs.
Oh my
That's
God.
great. What a shame that you feel the need to say whether or not you were good at it. Not because you're doing anything wrong, just a shame that our culture instills that like, is person good or not good in a performance as like the value in singing, dancing, acting, whatever. Like these are things that humans have done for as long as there have been humans. The idea that there's a way to be good at it or be bad at it in some in some general way is again a very new concept. If we're using good or bad as a placeholder for like enjoyable to the audience, then that is to some extent like
Yeah.
a meaningful concept. But when we say like straight up in this culture, if someone says I'm a good singer or a bad singer, primarily what they're saying is I can hit the note that I am supposed to hit without being flat or sharp. We all know that like there's other elements that go into being a good singer or bad singer, but mostly that's what people have encoded being good or bad as. And that really relies on like particular Western culture concepts of musicality and tone and scales and whatever. Like there's styles of music from other cultures that if Americans listen to it, they're like, oh, this is just noise. I just didn't have a ton of technical skill on the violin, but I enjoyed it. That's what I'm saying. And
you know what's
again,
interesting? I was interpreting it as I wasn't good at singing and not the violin. I was
oh yeah,
singing the other way.
well that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't actually interpreting that it was about singing, but that is the first example I was starting to use in talking about this. But that's for a different reason that I could explain. But I was probably not entirely in tune. But yeah, no, my response wasn't about like which thing you may or may not have been referring to being good at, just about like in this particular example, there is no reason to assume that it would be of interest to anyone or relevant to anyone to know whether you did a good job or a bad job at it, right? Like you were telling the story in reference to I just said that there was like the thing about the actors playing the instruments on stage. So you're telling a story about when you were an actor playing an instrument on stage. And we just, not that you were consciously thinking of this, I'm not accusing you of that, but that we have this like way of communicating about these things where it's like, if I tell someone, you know this very well, Olivia, right? Like if I tell someone that I was the lead in something, then I should also tell them like, was I good at it? Or do I think I was good at it?
Right, the reasoning behind.
Right.
Yeah.
The reason I went to singing is because my mental reference for this, I've referenced this before, there's an old comic, a web comic there's a web comic called Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereals, or Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal. And one of the comics years and years ago was like an adult and a child sitting on a hillside talking. and the kid saying something about like, what I remember it as, I don't know if this is accurate, is the kid saying something about how they enjoy singing, and then the adult saying something like, are you any good at it? And then the kid making this big philosophical point about like, humans have always sang, you know, without the idea of being good or bad at it, and pointing out, again, in my memory, pointing out the connection to, are you good at it, really meaning like, do you think that it is likely that you could make a living at it? Are you doing it in such a way where it is reasonable to think you could make money for your doing it? And then the like punchline at the end is the adult saying something about like pointing out how much it sucks to have been like socialized into thinking about things that way, and how nice it would be to think like a child in that way. That's why I referenced singing. I wasn't actually thinking about singing. I know very little about Fiddler compared to other musicals, but the only song I
The
could
beginning.
think of is the like,
If I were a rich man. That's all I can think
It's
of
not
too.
even like a technically challenging vocal song, or at least the parts of it that I know of. Sure, I think, I was probably not entirely too sure. I think in my head, I just figured saying I was the fiddler for Fiddler on the Roof sounds impressive, and I wanted to head that off. They never asked me to stop, so I figured it was good enough. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm pointing out, and why I was referencing Olivia is this is a thing that not everybody struggles with, or at least people struggle with to different extents for sure, which is this idea that like, I don't, if I do or say something that I think other people might find to be impressive, I'm a little uncomfortable about that, and I want to either make it, change it so that it no longer is something I think will make me sound impressive, or like apologize for coming across as impressive, being like, look, I know that might sound impressive. I'm not trying to be impressive. It's this like sense of discomfort with, are people going to think that I am trying to be impressive, or that I think of myself as impressive? And then things we do, again, not that we're thinking about this as we say it, but things we do in an attempt to be like, I don't want anyone to think that I think I'm super impressive, or that's what I'm trying to do here. Again, and I'm not criticizing or saying you shouldn't have done it. Just pointing out that this is a thing that happens in our culture. This idea of like, why you said earlier, not why you said, but part of the reason you were comfortable to say earlier, I like getting B's.
Sure.
Because
I'm ready.
Because it would be likely uncomfortable for a person to be like, oh, I always got A's and everything. Because like that could be impressive, and then people might think I'm bragging, or that I'm like, think highly of myself, or full of myself, or whatever. So it's acceptable, socially acceptable to be like, no, I'm a B student. I'm a B student. If anything, that's like makes it more likable and relatable. But to be like, no, I got perfect A's all the time. It's like, no, I don't want. It's only because my mom bribed the teachers and whatever. Like, it's not. I'm not trying to like be.
Yeah, there are some moments where like I relish in it for maybe 3 seconds, and then I'm like, all right, that 3 seconds is done. Now we gotta sway away.
You know that old joke of just the statement of like, I'm the most humble person in the world. It's that, right? Like, humility is one of the things that our culture preaches as a value, and so everybody wants to be. We all want it to be true of ourselves that we are humble. We also all want for other people to think of us as humble. Those are not separate things, but they are two different things. And yes, humility is one of those things that like anything you do to try to communicate to other people that you are humble is not quote unquote humble. I do try to phrase things carefully when I talk about things that might come off as bragging, because I found in my experience people tend to be very, very sensitive to perceived bragging. That is definitely true. And again, I'm not trying to point out that you shouldn't have done what you did, or that you're wrong for having said that. Just pointing these things out, like how, again, I don't think this is uniform. Not everybody does it the same. I don't think it's.
I have that same experience, and I'm thinking about how usually I'm thinking about how I perceive people bragging and my thoughts. And so I'm like, oh, they're probably thinking the way I think when I see people bragging. And it's this whole like self-narrative of like, I judge people for showing off or something.
Yes, and then it makes a lot of sense why we would connect bragging to sharing something that seems impressive,
Mhm.
but those are two different things. I feel like I hear people have incredibly strong feelings of dislike for people who they think are arrogant. Yes, they definitely, you will hear people say more about that than you'll hear people talk about how they don't like people who are smelly. You know, like there's plenty of things that people don't like, and some of those things we talk about more than other things, and there's reasons for that. Some of that is like the incidents at which it happens, like how often is it true that I encounter someone who I perceive as arrogant or bragging versus how often is it true that I encounter someone that I think of as smelly. Um, but there's other reasons too, like how socially acceptable it is to be bothered by something. If you're going to come in and complain about somebody who smelled, you're a jerk.
Mhm.
But if you're going to come in and complain about somebody who was bragging and arrogant, yeah, man, that sucks when people brag and are arrogant. They're the bad guy in this scenario.
Mhm.
Like these things get attached to good and bad.
Mhm.
Also, there's a higher, of the times that you are observing someone who is arrogant or bragging, there's a relatively high percentage of those times where you're just going to sit and listen to it and not do or say anything about it. Whereas like if somebody is being a bully or insulting or something like that, you're more likely to like be in a scenario where you want to or can or are incentivized to be like, hey, stop. Whereas like all kinds of times that we're in a meeting and this dude is just, or like I'm at a party and this guy is going off on like how cool he is and whatever, and me jumping into like say something or do something about that would be even worse than just like what's already happening. So then I'm going to talk about it more later because I have thoughts and feelings about it that I couldn't share in that moment. Important to me though, bragging, being arrogant, and being impressive are different things. It's understandable why we connect those things, but they're different. Yeah, it's weird to me. It feels like people hate arrogance more than like basic cruelty. Yeah, well, okay.
I was gonna say I've always attached to some idea of jealousy, but I don't know if there's something there or not.
You have to say more. Jealousy on whose part?
Jealousy on the people who are getting frustrated by the person being arrogant.
Okay. A few things. Part of that really depends on what you mean by basic cruelty. Because if you mean, there are certain things that you and many people would agree with you might refer to as basic cruelty, where many people wouldn't think of it as cruelty. Even if they would say it's not good or it's mean or whatever, they wouldn't call it cruelty. But things that are like relatively universally defined as cruelty, like animal abuse, right? Like you're not going to find people who are like, yes, I am more upset about people being braggadocious than I am about animal abuse. You will hear people talk about their dislike of someone who's being arrogant much more frequently than you hear people talk about how they are opposed to cruelty.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that, again, is because the cruelty thing isn't something that I'm as likely to observe and therefore want to talk about. If and when I do observe something I think of as cruelty, I'm more likely to like do something about that instead of just being like, this is annoying and I can't do anything about it, and so therefore I want to talk about it more later. Also, I am not likely to think that something that I think of as cruelty, like animal abuse, I'm just going to assume everybody else also thinks of it as cruelty. So I don't have a lot of reason to like check, like this person was being cruel, right? Whereas arrogance is much more likely that there are going to be times where like, I think someone was being arrogant, but other people didn't. And this plays into the jealousy thing that you're talking about. That like, there was a situation where like this person is being so arrogant or they're bragging so much, but everybody else seems to like be eating it up. So maybe I'm the one that's wrong. And whenever it's something like that, this is called reality checking, that I'll then like bring it to someone that I can talk to. And even if I'm not necessarily thinking about it or phrasing it in this way, part of what I'm doing is like, no, this is arrogant, right? And I'm going to describe it in a way that shows like, look at how arrogant this was. So that when you're like, yeah, that's arrogant, I'm like, okay, good. I was right about that. It's the other people that, or maybe everybody else was just not saying anything like me, but everybody thought it was arrogant. But if I say this to you, my friend, and I'm like, look at this and this and this and that, and you're like, I think you might just be jealous, depending on how it's phrased. But like one of the potential outcomes is like, okay, yeah, that's me. That's on me. They weren't being a jerk.
My mom's a great person for me to do that with. She's so good at pointing out, like, hang on, what was actually happening?
Yeah, so this actually goes in earlier. We were talking about that, like everybody else seems happy thing. There's this assumption that the extent to which we hear someone talk about something is directly correlated to the extent to which people experience that thing. So if I hear people talking about how much they hate arrogance more, then maybe they hate arrogance more than they hate something else they talked about less. If I hear everybody talking about being happy and I don't hear them talking about being sad, then they're just happy and they're not sad. And there's reasons to go that route. Like it is generally a good thing, beneficial, useful thing to treat other people as though what they're saying is true and not try to make your own assumptions about what. But again, this is one of those things that to me is in the simple concept of, 0 to 10 and down to -10. Assuming that I know what they're really experiencing and it's different than what they're saying, I would put on the negative side. Not that it's never the case. Sometimes we are correct in our thinking or whatever, but that's where there's a lot of risk. But the alternative doesn't have to be, and therefore I assume that what they're saying is directly correlated to what their experience is. In this case, to me, it's the 0. I'm not going to assume that they aren't saying their experience or that their real experience is different than what is coming across. But I also don't need to assume that like it is exactly correlated.
Right.
And that's not to say that they're lying or whatever. Like I just pointed out a bunch of reasons why a person would talk more about arrogance than cruelty. So it's not that I'm saying like I think differently than what they're saying. It's just I'm not going to assume that what they're saying and the extent to which they're saying it is directly correlated to what they're experiencing and the extent to which they're experiencing. There are other variables in whether I say something and what I say than just am I experiencing it.
That's fair.
That's fair. I think I'm partially thinking of real life social interactions, like they're more likely to forgive someone who insulted someone to their face than someone who talks about their nice vacation too much. Yeah. And then I'm partially thinking about people tending to like characters definitively portrayed as bad people in stories, but they hate a character who seems arrogant. All right, a couple of thoughts. That first one I agree with, and that's part of what I was talking about with like, you're talking about forgiving someone who insulted someone else to their face. So if you're forgiving them, that person has apologized, right? You're talking about a situation in which somebody did something in some way, shape, or form. It was brought to their attention that doing that was something bad. They now have expressed remorse, whether or not they actually feel it, and I forgive them. Someone who talked about their nice vacation too much, nobody is pointing out to that person that they talked about their nice vacation too much, and therefore they don't express any remorse, and there's nothing to forgive. It is possible that you meant by forgive, you're not talking about them having expressed remorse, just like I can allow, okay, they insulted someone else to their face and nothing was said or done about it, and I'm okay with that more than the person who talked about their nice vacation too much. That, though, I would suggest is not an accurate statement. It might be accurate that they complain more about the person who talked about their nice vacation too much, or talk about it more behind their back when someone, when that person's not there anymore, than they talk about like how much that person insulted that other person to their face. Part of that, though, too, is like what is an insult and whether or not that person intended to insult.
I wasn't assuming they apologized. I was assuming they did it, and maybe someone thought it was a little mean, but they forgot about it quickly.
Yeah. So that's what I was saying there is like, I'm not, it's possible that you were referring to it that way, right? And even in that case, what you're using as the marker of did they forget about it or not is, are they talking to me about it or not later? And there are other reasons that a person might be more likely to talk about that someone talked about their vacation too much. It's lower stakes, less confrontational, right? Like if you and I can just kind of tease our buddy about how much he was going on about his vacation, but it's a different conversation to be like, our friend just was really insulting there, right?
Right.
Like that's a
Right.
different level of stakes. It's also, I might clock something as insulting, but insulting is about, depending on how you're using the term, it's about how the person who receives the insult is caused to feel
Mhm.
by it, or about how the person who is saying the insult intends to cause the other person to feel.
Mhm.
Like I could insult you, but you interpret it differently and
Right.
therefore are not insulted. Whereas I could compliment you, but you could interpret it in a way where you've now been insulted.
Right.
So that lack of clarity might, again, make it less likely that I'm going to like, because I could be like, well, maybe I'm interpreting it differently, or maybe they didn't mean it, or unintentional, blah, 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 whatever.
Mhm.
Also, if I am going to talk to someone about the fact that this person insulted this person to their face, if we take every instance of a person talking to another person about someone who's insulted someone, and every instance of a person talking to another person about how arrogant or how much they were talking about their vacation, in this first category, a larger percentage of that is going to be talking about it to the person who did the insulting or to the person who was insulted. A smaller percentage of that, not nothing, but a smaller percentage of that is going to be to a third party who was neither of those people. Whereas someone who's talking about their vacation too much, the vast majority of the time is going to be talking to another person, not the person who was talking about it, who was there with me, or if they weren't, who I think would feel similarly about it as I do had they been there.
Mhm.
In other words, I'm commiserating with this person of like,
Right.
that was so annoying, right?
Brendan, you don't watch White Lotus, do you?
I watched the first several episodes of the first season, but never finished the first
Yeah.
season. Haven't watched it.
I'm just thinking about the character thing in the second mention here of like it's so masterfully written in the sense that like all the characters have flaws and things and everyone is wrong in their own way, and like even though their characters are arrogant and annoying, like you're still so invested in it. Like there is no good guy per se, and I don't know.
Well, okay, so that I think you're referencing like we can
How bad people
talking
are.
about like how we think about bad people in the stories, but we dislike characters who are arrogant.
Yeah. All these
But
characters.
the example that you just used is a bunch of bad people, and a lot of what makes them bad is how arrogant they are.
Sure, totally. Yeah.
So I think some of that is just a difference in language. And I have another point about why this is coming up that I'll try and make sure to get to. But like as a very common example of like the bad person in a narrative that people love would be like Deadpool or Wolverine. And I'm jumping to this because a lot of the time when people are talking about like how people like the bad characters, that tells you something about like what kinds of media and what kinds of fandom or people are they talking to in regards to that media that they're experiencing. And so in certain things like the anti-hero, it always annoyed me that everybody loved Wolverine. Like when I was a kid, I loved X-Men, the old 90s Saturday morning cartoon. And everyone loved Wolverine, and I found it so annoying. And everyone hated Cyclops, and I found that so annoying because he's like the stand-up goody-good Boy Scout, Cyclops, and Wolverine's like the rugged loner, blah, blah, blah. But they're written that way. Those ones in particular are written to a population of people who is more likely to see themselves as the rugged loner, you know, who has a heart of gold, but everybody misinterprets them and their gruff exterior. Less likely that someone who's like reading a lot of comic books, especially at the time, is like, I'm a very popular leader and everyone looks to me for everything all the time.
Yeah.
It's not nothing, but you know, statistically. And that also is true of the people who are writing the comic books.
Yeah.
You know, like which characters are they more likely to sympathize with? And so yes, there are going to be a lot, even in ways that aren't intentional. This is like implicit bias stuff. There's going to tend to be more in a comic book story about like that cool popular jock that everyone thinks is so awesome is actually kind of a jerk. And like that loner that everyone misunderstands is really a good guy. And it's BS that the prom queen went to dance with the homecoming king instead of me.
Right.
Which like, you're not going to find a better example of that trope than Wolverine, Cyclops, and Jean Grey. It's like, why is the cheerleader dating that dumb jock? So there's some of that. Some of the time, though, there are like narratives which are very clearly positioned to try and humanize the bad character. That's a thing that artists deliberately do on purpose. It's like, I want to tell a story where we see this person as a bad guy, but then we see like past that.
Mm-hmm. The Joker.
No, the Joker would generally, to me.
Okay.
Oh, you were talking about the more recent movies.
I'm talking about the more recent movies.
I haven't seen those.
Gotcha.
But maybe, yeah.
It gives more backstory.
Yeah. I guess that would probably. I don't know,
Sure,
but that would
sure.
probably fall in that category.
Yeah.
But like other versions of the Joker, very much the anti-hero. Like, this guy doesn't play by the rules, you know. Kind of the way that the general populace responded to the in-movie Joker of these recent Jokers, like how cool he is that he doesn't like follow society's rules and whatever. I mean, I think that's deliberately an allegory to the actual fans of the actual character, the Joker. Is like, y'all are celebrating this monster
Sure.
just because you're also upset and angry about the unfairness of our system, which is valid, but that doesn't make this dude less of a monster,
Sure.
and you shouldn't worship him. Which I know everybody hated Joker 2.
I didn't see Joker.
They didn't
Mhm.
either. Maybe because they haven't been murdered by a hungry vampire spawn, but they have dealt with annoying, arrogant people. Yeah, for sure that's part of it. Like, some is fantastical and some like real life more.
Can we define arrogant? Like, I think that just like hit me. Like, what does that actually mean?
So they have a more emotional connection to annoying arrogance than like murder. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Murder is theoretical and abstract.
Uh-huh.
For most people, obviously it happens for real. I personally don't know anyone who has committed or been a victim of or been very closely linked. Well, I guess I have a distant family member who was murdered, whatever. Murder is generally an abstract concept to people, generally speaking. It happens at very low rates population-wise. Whereas, yes, everybody knows people who are annoying and arrogant. Defining arrogance. If a person is complaining to me about arrogance or is concerned about arrogance, then obviously we need to find out what that person means by it.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what I would say is, when I'm saying my definition, I'm saying what I think generally people are referring to. Is a person who has an inflated opinion of themselves, meaning their opinion of themselves is higher than is warranted.
Mhm.
Someone who thinks they're really awesome, but I agree they are exactly as awesome as they think they are, I'm not likely to call them arrogant.
Sure.
I'm more likely to call them confident. And yes, whether you call someone confident or arrogant, that's part of why this one gets reality checked so much more. Because if I'm standing, like, this is a very common, if I'm at a party and there's like a bunch of us in a circle and this person's talking a lot, and I think they're really arrogant, but everybody else, everybody else is laughing, or at least other people are, I'm aware of the idea that it's possible that other people like what this person is saying and that I'm the one or one of the few that doesn't, but that what he's doing is not uncalled for because like people are enjoying it and feeding into it and whatever. So there's more reason for me to talk to other people about, like, is that arrogance or is that confidence? Because we can all be observing the same thing and a bunch of us are like, man, this person's so confident and charming, it's awesome. And some of us can be like, what an arrogant jerk. Because it really matters what your opinion is of
Everything
them
feels so made up.
and what you think their opinion is of themselves.
Uh-huh.
Yes, this is not a real thing. Meaning, again, I have to say it every time. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter or it's unimportant. It has an impact. But like so many of this stuff, like good and bad, this is not an observable thing. We're talking about the way that I think or the way that people might think of something. Yeah, to me, both and Gale both portray confidence, even if they aren't inherently confident people, but it strongly irks people who don't think it's deserved, so they see it as arrogance. Kvothe is the main character from the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. Gale, I'm not sure which Gale you're referring to. There are a few different ones. And it's been a while since I read Kingkiller, so maybe it's another character in that, but you could also be referring to the guy from Baldur's Gate 3, is who I think you're referring to, but you can clarify if I'm wrong. Both of whom are like powerful wizards and
So they have an emotional connection.
oh, sorry, did my previous comment not come through? Perhaps not. The last comment we saw before the Kvothe and Gale thing was so they have a more emotional connection to annoying arrogance than like murder. Is that the one you're referring to? If so, I don't see, because neither of those, to my knowledge, neither of those characters are vampire spawn. Although, okay, in Baldur's Gate 3, one of the other characters who people love generally is vampire spawn. What's the dude's name? I'm blanking on his name. People I've talked to have a strong revulsion of Gale in Baldur's Gate 3 and Kvothe in Name of the Wind because they think both are arrogant. But they love Astarion, Shadowheart, Lae'zel, Loki, and Adventures, etc. Astarion, Shadowheart, and Lae'zel are also from Baldur's Gate 3, and Astarion is the vampire spawn one. Again, partly how they're written, partly which population of people are likely to interact with these forms of media. Again, like neither Baldur's Gate 3 nor King Color Chronicles are like super obscure. They're both wildly successful in their niche, but it's not everybody. And like, while we certainly don't want to like rely on stereotypes when talking to and interacting with individual people or making policy decisions or whatever, there's also no meaningful way to talk about large groups of people without talking about trends and things. And so, you know, people who play Baldur's Gate 3 and who read, like Patrick Rothfuss, who is, I think, an incredibly skilled author. His prose is amazing. Someone who has that talent with language and wrote like lit fic would have been like the toast of New York for decades.
The toast of New York?
The toast of the town, you know, like everyone would be celebrating them. He writes novels that read like poetry, including in one of the books, there are chapters and chapters where like with some like little fudging here and there, the entire thing's written in iambic pentameter for like chapters, thousands of words, which nobody does since Shakespeare.
So my boyfriend talks about Cormac McCarthy, just like
exactly
being so enamored with the language. And
Cormac McCarthy is one of those that gets lauded for like his skill with prose.
Yeah.
But Patrick Rothfuss wrote genre fiction. He used to study poetry in college. Makes sense. You know, specifically high fantasy, you know, epic fantasy. And people just perceive and respond to those things in different ways. If he wrote like that, but it was a story instead of set in a different world, like Kvothe goes off to like a university to learn magic and whatever. If he had told the same story but set in our world, and it's Harvard instead of, I don't even remember the name of the university. It might be one of those ones where it's just called the university. I don't remember. It's very funny every time Kvothe insults poetry in the books. Yeah. Hell, honestly, the fact that the character is named Kvothe, Kvothe, for anyone who's not reading the comments. I read the books.
Yeah.
So I don't even know if that's how it's intended to be pronounced. I read fantasy books all the time where like the pronunciation I have in my head, I find out later is not what it was supposed to be.
Totally.
Some people listen to these on audiobooks, so then there's like an established,
Sure.
This is what it's supposed to be. Oh, it is the university. Okay. It's one of those worlds where there's only one university, you know. But like just that, naming the character that,
Quoth.
pronounced quote. Oh, does it say that in the books and I just totally forgot or missed it? That happened. Another example in the Wheel of Time series, which is one of my favorites of all time. There's a character whose name is spelled Nynaeve. which I pronounced Nineveh in my head, but the correct pronunciation is Nynaeve. And did not get that at all. And by the time I found out about it, I'm like,
Nope.
There are times where I try to pronounce it correctly, but for the most part, I'm like, what a waste. I don't need to expend effort trying to correct my pronunciation.
Yeah. Yes, it
Not
was
relevant.
mentioned.
Yeah, towards the very beginning. Easy to forget. And honestly, by the time I would have read that, I already would have had to have figured out a pronunciation in my mind.
Right.
And so then changing it at that point it's not like I'm opposed to it or whatever. It just takes resources.
I have a hard time with books that have such beautiful language because I know I'm forgetting it after I've read it. And it makes me sad that I can't remember or relish in it.
That's like saying I have a hard time with delicious meals because once it's over, I don't enjoy the taste anymore.
Or I also am aware
You're
that
assuming that the point
I know.
of the experience is to remember and understand it, rather than just some things are to be experienced.
Yeah. Or I don't clock everything and I'm like, there's stuff I'm missing in here.
That has a lot to do with how our culture talks about reading and writing, especially how we teach it. There's a reason that there are many, many people who love reading up through middle school, and then after high school, they don't read for fun ever again. One of my favorite quotes. Let me find it. I'm curious what this quote is. Anyway, I was saying just the fact that the name is that makes it more difficult to discuss, even among fans of the book, and therefore less likely that we're going to discuss it, which spreads word of mouth less. And identify, when you try to talk about it to somebody else, there's a higher possibility that they're going to be annoyed with oh my gosh, what is that's how that's spelled, ridiculous.
My boyfriend made a card game and he had people doing playthroughs and he makes up words very fancy with language, and he would get so sad when people were fast forwarding over the names of monsters in his games because he worked so hard on it, and even working on the design of the box and thinking okay, how do I make this accessible to people but also something that I want to share this lore and things. And
so someone I think, and I know I've mentioned this person before, someone I think who does a really great job with that is Brandon Sanderson.
Yes, you have mentioned.
And he also gets derided for this to some extent because the names of every organization and every it's always something very clear cut and accessible. Those are the Charred, the people with the burn marks on them, they're called the Charred.
Sure.
As opposed to in the Dune series, the Bene Gesserit, or in real time, the Aes Sedai, making up these words.
Yeah.
As though making up words is in some way more literary because it's less accessible, and especially in certain populations, certain demographics are more likely, there's going to be a higher proportion of those demographics that value inaccessibility in and of itself. They're dumbing this down for the masses makes it less good than when you had to have a dictionary open next to you to really get through it, And I'm not opposed to that in all circumstances, right? If you were to translate Shakespeare into modern language, that loses the point. That's not what Shakespeare's for. But it doesn't mean that being accessible is inherently bad.
Sure.
I cannot remember the books I've read any more than the meals I have eaten. Even so, they have made me. Yeah. Who's that by? I like that.
Oh, that's so nice.
That's a point that I'm trying to make to people all the time when I say understanding is not the only thing.
That's all you needed to say.
I like this quote. Please tell me who it's by so I can utilize it. Because yes, we are impacted by things. We grow and we develop. Understanding stuff is helpful for certain things in certain ways.
Okay, I've been code investigating. It looks like it might actually be Ralph Waldo. I love him. I don't want to spread misinformation though.
Yeah, he is one of those ones that I'm always
is.
Suspicious when it gets attributed to him too, because you could just throw anything.
My dog's named after Ralph Waldo.
Anything that calls attention to our lives and how things aren't as dark as people want to make it out to be, But yeah, I mean, we all know this. We talk about trauma, for example, that you don't have to understand or have an intellectual ability to take away this is the thing that was said and how it impacted me, and this is how I can think about it and use it in order for it to impact you. But it's especially for therapists, but for anybody who cares about which everybody cares about how they impact others and being helpful and not causing problems, whatever. Very, very uncomfortable to acknowledge that no matter what I'm trying to do, I'm going to impact you. I can sit there silently. That has an impact on you. Like, I cannot not impact you, and I cannot predict exactly how everything I do will impact you.
Yeah.
Which means that sometimes I'm going to impact you in ways that you don't like and didn't want. I wouldn't have wanted. I don't like, and I can call that harming you, although there's problems in using that terminology. But like, that's it. The only way to make sure that you don't ever have an undesirable impact on another person is to never interact with that person. Although even then you could argue that like, well, that's a different impact than would have been had you interacted with them. So much of this is just people trying not to like fail or make mistakes or mess up, because if it's true that there's this thing inside of me that determines whether I will succeed or fail generally or at any given thing, every time I fail, that's evidence that it's low and I'm going to fail at other things. We have generalized success and failure, which is absurd and incredibly problematic. The idea that like, if I fail to understand what this person just said, that means I will fail at going to college later, or fail in my career or in my love life, or just at everything. We now treat failure as though it is more or less a sign that we are going to die soon. Instead of just, nope, there was something I was trying to accomplish and I failed. Or making a mistake where something that I did impacted things in a way that I would not have wanted it to happen, whether I knew that or didn't know that or whatever. Like, you know, I accidentally or unknowingly did something. I did something without realizing it would cause this person to feel bad, but it did cause them to feel bad. That's a mistake. I'm trying to make this person feel good, but I don't make them feel good. That's a failure. And those are not like inherently bad things, or at least they don't correlate to any kind of predictions about the future. Looks like it could have been Ralph Waldo Emerson or a different G.B. Emerson, and they might have gotten mixed up. It's unclear, but Ralph Waldo Emerson might be a little more plausible, so it's very possible he said it. Fair enough. I like that. That's the kind of thing that I do too, where it's like, I am aware that other people probably don't care. Like,
so basically, Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Right. I could just say Ralph Waldo Emerson and nobody else is going to be like upset later about like, but are you sure? But like, I just like to be precise anyway.
My dog, Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, we call her Emmy for short.
I do like the transcendentalists. We're going to wrap it up soon, so I want to go back and look at like what things we've opened up without resolving. Oh, arrogance. Okay. Here's an additional piece to that, which is anything that I am afraid might happen to me is something I'm going to be more aware of whenever it happens at all. So if I am very afraid of people thinking of me as arrogant, then I am going to notice instances where I think of other people as being arrogant at a higher rate. I'm going to notice and remember incidences where other people complain about other people being arrogant at a higher rate. Whereas if I am, for example, not worried about whether people think I'm shy, then I'm not going to notice as much when someone's being shy. And I'm not going to notice and remember when people are complaining about someone being shy as much. So part of this is about like what things you've experienced that you didn't like.
So people aren't worried about being perceived as a murderer then?
Yeah, partly that. Again, like, obviously we don't like all murderers. We like the murderers and narratives that are presented to us in a way where we are supposed to be able to empathize with them. Like, we all have engaged with plenty of narratives with murderers that were like, no, that's a terrible person, no questions. But sometimes there's ones where like, sure, they're a murderer, but look how cool they are. Look how attractive they are. You know, like at this point, vampires, especially the entire genre, is just like, sometimes people who do monstrous things are really hot and interesting and it's out of their control. And, you know, like you can maybe save them if you can see past the fact that they have murdered 1,000 people, you know. Also, those people are presented as being in need of help. That is part of why this gets perceived in this way, right? Like the vampire spawn, you can help them. But like the confident leader, like that guy doesn't need your help, right? He does, but we don't think of it in that way.
Wow.
Anyway, I started developing a metaphor over the weekend in my mind, and I almost forgot it, and I had to get it back later. And so it's helpful to me to like share it out so that I'll work through it. Like I only started it because I can't finish these things until I'm actually saying them to people, and I'll remember it more, and it's relevant to this to some extent. So
On with it.
taking the opportunity, because this is about understanding and how it impacts how people feel and behave. That like, do you know what craps is?
Craps.
Craps is the game, you've seen it on TV or in movies
Okay.
where people like are gambling and they're rolling dice.
Okay.
And in particular, I'm using this one for the metaphor because it is often presented in media as like the person doing it has no idea what they're doing, but someone else is just like, you're trying to roll a 7. Okay. So I'm using that for the metaphor. That if a person was to play craps and not know how it works, they have no understanding of the game. They don't know what's a good result or a bad result, or at least they don't know how to get it or whatever. They do know that sometimes they roll dice and people cheer and they get money. And sometimes they roll dice and people groan and money is taken away from them. This is how every activity starts for all people, because nobody has an understanding of how something works until you've interacted with it.
Mm-hmm.
We do. In fact, we spend, at this point in our culture, in our history, we spend a ton of resources trying to give people an intellectual understanding of something before they actually engage with it. But even that requires that we engage with it in like academic or practice ways, ways that are removed from the actual result, the stakes, whatever. So anyway, the first time you're doing something, you don't understand how it works. You're just doing something. But you can tell based on how people react if what you did is something that everybody likes or doesn't like.
Brandon, I want you to watch the show Game Changer so bad for this reason.
Okay.
Because every time it's a new game, and the only way to learn is by playing the game, and it's super fun.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I'll try it. I'll ask you later about what it's
Yeah.
streaming on. Depending on those experiences, those first experiences, that's gonna new season today.
Yes. I didn't know it was today, but I saw the advert. Oh wait.
I do love Astarion, and I can't really blame him for the whole murder thing. That's the vampire song. Game Changers is the best.
Okay, good. I was like, I hope I was reading that right because I did see an ad about Game Changer coming out soon. Great trailer.
That thing, by the way, about like Astarion and like about people, whatever. It plays into this thing we also do in our culture where like it's cooler / okay, in fact, even encouraged to be proud of having difficulty in your background.
And I didn't hear. I was too enamored with love the trailer.
I love the trailer. Meaning like if I grew up poor and my parents are divorced and whatever, like that's okay. And it's not only okay, it's like something that I am encouraged to be proud of, and people think of me as cool, like, wow, you've been through a lot. Not like that's good that happened to you, but like my estimation of you is either unchanged or goes higher. Whereas if I'm like, oh no, I was born to very rich parents who were very loving and supportive of me my whole life, and I haven't experienced a lot of difficulty, and then like, screw you, man. Like,
Yeah.
You shouldn't be proud of that. You should be ashamed of your privilege and whatever. And if you tell me about it, unless you are telling me about how you're ashamed of yourself, then I'm going to think you suck. Which isn't entirely true, but like that's a Everybody Loves the Game. I watched that trailer like 10 times. That's a song. I don't know what the jingle is though.
Song that the
There's
CEO
notes, right?
of Dropout sings in his little pinstripe outfit.
Interesting. I always wonder when there's companies like that where like the CEO also happens to be like does he perform on the show, or
He's the host of that specific show.
See, that makes me wonder about like what is the CEO's job title in that organization that like some significant chunk of his time is spent being talent on a show,
Mhm.
Anyway.
But others, he's like, never put me on the show again. Absolutely not. What's the mayor of a small town where everybody sings?
Who's the mayor of a small town where everybody sings now? I
don't know.
I don't even know. Is that a setup or a lyric or an actual question?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I did not watch it 10 times, so I would not be able to. Is there a town where everybody sings?
Maybe I think it might be a joke setup. Like the answer is a jokey pun.
That's the Make Some Noise reference. Oh, man.
I don't know. Make some noise.
There's too many episodes in that for me to remember all that. But the idea is not to remember. It's okay.
The idea is not to remember. That would say that like what I'm trying to do is not to remember.
Okay.
It's not what you're trying to do.
Sure.
But the idea is whatever it is.
Sure.
The idea of as an experience where like the value of it is that it's enjoyable is to enjoy it.
Yeah.
You know, like my kids, as I assume that many children do, will like turn lots of things into races.
Mm-hmm.
Where like whoever finishes their dinner first won dinner or whatever.
Sure.
And I've been trying to explain to them their whole lives like, no. Eating quickly is not the objective. You don't win a meal by eating it the fastest. It's not competitive. But if there was going to be a competition, the person who would win is the person who enjoyed it the most.
My cousins and I know we have to start getting wrapped up. My cousins and I, during every dinner that we would have at holidays, we would sit in the basement and we would decide somebody would be like the point master, and they would just arbitrarily give people at the table points. So like 10 points for complimenting me, negative points for not eating that, or like it was very, I don't know, fun.
I can't imagine how that might have played into your worries about comparing oneself to others and feeling like you're better than others for arbitrary reasons.
Yeah, who knows?
There was one where a friend of Sam's was on it, and he spent the whole time throwing well-crafted insults at Sam. And the best one was, "You look like the mayor of a town where everybody's."
Oh, that's lovely. That's great. That's really
I like
funny.
that. I love insults like that. It was like that insult structure. You look like the blank of,
It's a
like
classic,
a very
yeah.
complex thing. It's one that I use in my personal life a lot. You look like if blank had a baby with blank, or you look like the.
Do you have one that
Barbie
you've
Good version
received?
of blank.
About you?
I'm sure, but I
Don't
not that I
remember.
can remember off the
Yeah.
top of my head. Anyway, the metaphor. So
Craps.
those early experiences matter a lot
Mhm.
in how you engage with that thing moving forward. If you roll the dice and everybody cheers, then you're not so concerned about like understanding how the game works because it
Mhm.
went great,
Right.
and you'll do it again, and everybody cheers. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
As long as things are working out, why do I need to spend resources trying to figure out how this game works?
Mm-hmm.
If you do it and it goes terribly and you lose, you also don't necessarily care about understanding how the game works, because I'm just not going to play this game, right?
Sure.
Like I tried it once, okay, I'll try it a second time. No, it still went bad. Like, this is dumb. I don't want to do this anymore. The ones where you really want to understand is like, yay, 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 no, yay, yay, no. Like, it's got to be, the ratio of success to failure has to be high enough to keep me engaged in this activity, but the failures have to be frequent enough and impactful enough that I'm like, okay, I'm not going to stop doing this, but I am going to spend more resources trying to figure out how it works so I can have an even better ratio of success to failure. So, but depending on like what that ratio of success to failure is will dictate how long you keep doing it and how much you invest into it and how badly you feel. If you succeed 10 times and then fail before you understand, I don't like that, but I don't take blame for that because I don't understand it. But if I then learn to understand it and now I succeed 10 times and then I fail, dang it,
Mm-hmm.
I messed it up, right? Like understanding brings with it more likelihood that you're going to blame yourself for any failures.
Yeah.
Because you tried to understand it in part so that you wouldn't fail.
This is good, Brandon. Yeah.
So people seeking to understand things are generally, not always, but generally looking to make it so that they don't mess up.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to understand what comes across as arrogant or whether somebody would see you as trying to brag or, make it seem like you're impressive is something that is very likely to happen for a person who has been perceived as confident and charming, you get the good result a lot of time. And then every once in a while, you get the bad result where someone thinks you're arrogant. It's like, dang it. The more that happens, the more you're going to try and figure out what is the difference between when I'm going to come across as confident and when it's arrogance. So, in other words, a person who is very worried about coming across as arrogant tells you that person has had a ton of experiences of being seen as very successful and valuable.
Sure.
Somebody that like nobody ever thinks they're cool isn't worried about coming across as arrogant. A person who their entire experience, everybody's like, that person sucks. They're doing everything they can to be perceived as cool. Not like, I gotta be careful. If I'm not careful, I'll just accidentally and unknowingly do stuff that'll make people think I'm cool.
Right. Fascinating.
Yeah, where generally like the things that people are most worried about are things that don't happen for that person very often. Mm-hmm. But we confuse rate and volume statistics, meaning like the best free throw shooters in the world are missing free throws constantly all the time. They miss more free throws in a week than I have missed in the last 17 years.
Right.
But their percentage of makes versus misses is very different than mine. Mm-hmm. So having a lot of experiences of being seen as arrogant or coming across as arrogant or having people respond to you as though you are arrogant doesn't mean that you are very arrogant. It means most likely that the proportion of when you are doing something that puts one at risk of being perceived as being arrogant, whenever you're doing that kind of thing, like talking or performing or, putting things out there, that the vast majority of the time it goes really well.
Mm-hmm. I like too many thoughts happening right now. I'm thinking about Tony Hawk and his skating and how I watched a documentary on him and how he was like, he tries and tries and tries. And then finally, once he finally gets the trick figured out, he just moves on and like, it's just forgets about it because he did it and great. Okay. Like doesn't celebrate it. And I didn't know if maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Let me go back.
I believe that this was said in an interview.
Uh-huh.
This does not at all match like what a real person would do.
Okay.
So whether it was meant to express something different than what I'm interpreting, or as often happens, people say things that aren't really accurate. Like
sure.
I have seen him celebrate after nailing the first 1080,
sure.
Also he competed on like in events, right? So no, he didn't do a trick once and then never do it again. He would have had to keep drilling it over and over and over to the point where he's maybe he meant like mastered it. Once I get to the point where I can do it every time, then I move on.
I don't
but
remember.
Like that's what should happen for anyone.
Yeah.
Once you get to the point where it's like 100% of the time I do this, why would I keep focusing on how to improve?
I'm wondering what it was he said that is so notable to me.
I have some guesses, just not knowing anything about him or the specific interview, but with how these things tend to go, where like a lot of what successful people are getting asked about in interviews is like, how are you so successful? And nobody knows the answer to that question. That is an unknowable, like the number of variables that could have impacted this are beyond the possibility that I could even be aware of them. But I have to give some answer. And what I'm going to give is some answer that I think might be useful to other people, right? Like if someone's asking, how did you become so successful? Part of what I'm assuming there is that they're asking so that they themselves or so that other people can learn how to be more successful like me. So I'm answering that question as though it's, what piece of advice would you give to somebody else who is also trying to be successful like you have been? Yeah. So I'm going to talk about something that I did notice about my own experience, but also something that other people can do, right? When someone's like, how have you become so successful? Nobody ever answers that question by being like, well, my parents were millionaires.
Right.
Like, because that, it's not that I'm ashamed of that necessarily, but like, that's not useful to you.
Right, on the first bullet
point. Anybody
yeah.
can do about that. So I'm going to tend to focus on things that theoretically other people can do and theoretically as many or anybody can do. You just got to want it hard enough. You got to dedicate yourself, focus, whatever. Because that's the answer people are looking for. It's not that the person is like a jerk for saying that. you're basically getting asked, without it being phrased this way, if someone's like, can you tell
Dang,
our
better get an
readers,
appearance.
can you tell our readers how to be just as successful as you without any other information about them besides the fact that they want to be successful? The only answer to that question is you gotta want it.
Yeah.
It's a meaningless answer. But anyway, I'm guessing that what he was saying was something along the lines, or maybe not what he was saying, but the way it was portrayed, I'm guessing, was something along the lines of like, you gotta never be satisfied. Like once you master something, you can't just rest on your laurels. And that he probably wasn't phrasing it like that, but saying that about it like it's a characteristic of his, like I'm never satisfied.
Yeah.
In his case, I am aware that he is known to be diagnosed ADHD. So I'm going to
He did
guess.
lose all his money at one point.
I'm going to guess that it was framed in that way, kind of like I can't sit still. I hate being bored. I need a challenge. So like
Sure.
I keep getting better because I'm always challenging myself to that next step. And as soon as I've mastered it, it's not a challenge anymore. I'm looking for the next challenge.
Sure.
That what he's saying is like, I find joy in the pursuit of improvement itself, not in the outcome. I like the outcome too.
Yeah.
Whatever he said or whatever was presented of like, I don't celebrate it. I doubt he said I don't celebrate
Right, that's
it.
my word
Like,
choice also.
but that was the impression that was given.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that what was said was something along the lines of like, it's great to get trophies, it's great to win, whatever, but that's not why I do it.
Yeah.
I do it because I always want to find that next challenge, master that next thing, which you interpreted as not celebrating, in part because you are worried about being perceived as someone who celebrates themselves too much. So advice on how to be successful that says like, don't celebrate yourself.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, good, I do that. I don't celebrate myself.
I do.
Well, not as much as other people do. You put effort towards limiting the extent to which you celebrate your accomplishments, or you wouldn't have remembered that statement in that way. Like you're thinking, here's a really cool, successful guy, and this is a thing that's worth noticing and
This is
remembering.
true.
And what he said is like he doesn't celebrate himself.
Yeah,
he
I'll
just
have
moves on.
Instagram videos where I'll talk about something that like I'm really proud of myself for the day. And then I'll be like, meh, you don't need to share this. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't.
But here's the thing: do you want other people to celebrate themselves?
Yes,
Well,
more than ever.
anybody who's following your Instagram or anybody who would be impacted by what you put on
I
Instagram
got a lot of lurkers.
is someone who is likely that if they see you do something, they're more likely to do it. Whether that's a conscious, like, I'm going to try and do that thing, or just like you're normalizing it or giving
Constantly
them the idea or whatever.
modeling.
Yeah. This goes back to the listening thing, listening to other humans.
Mhm.
That if you try to figure out what you want, regardless of what anybody else wants from you, good luck to you.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Everything every person wants is built on top of what they think other people want. That's not bad, the way people want to make it sound bad. It is how it works. Like you can't think of the thing that you most want for yourself, not for anybody else, just what you want for yourself. Now imagine that in order to get that thing, someone you love would be killed.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still want it the exact same amount?
No.
Probably don't want it at all anymore under those circumstances, right? Like if we're saying that someone should want something regardless of what they think other people would want, then we're asking people to be a sociopath, which again, I don't think is real. But I think it's a useful construct for us to have this idea that there are people like that. For the same reasons it's useful to have ideas that there are bad people and narcissists and all these other things. But the downside of accepting those concepts as being real things that people are is that you now have to worry about whether you're one of them. If it's possible to be it, no person who believes that it is possible for people to be narcissistic never worries that they might be narcissistic. No person who thinks it is possible for someone to be arrogant never has an experience of worrying whether they're arrogant. That's the danger in these concepts. It's not that they're not useful. It's that if you treat them as though they are real, actual observable things, defining qualities or characteristics, as opposed to they just talk about, they label the way that someone perceives something. If I think someone's a bad person, it just means I don't like them and or what they're doing or what I know about them or my idea of who they are. It doesn't describe something intrinsic about who they are. If I think it describes something intrinsic about who they are, well, what if that's true about me then?
Mm-hmm.
But if I don't like what they're doing, if I just accept that that's what bad means, it's something I don't like or something I don't want or I disagree with, then I don't have to worry about whether that's true of me. There will be times where I might not like what I'm doing or disagree with what I'm doing. That's fine. But I'll never be in a case where I'm like, do I dislike it? You either do or you don't. You know if you do or you don't.
Sounds so familiar from this morning.
Yeah.
When I checked in with you.
Yeah, we gotta wrap up. Having said all that, this all is very interesting and useful to people who want to explore things on like, this is the equivalent of like teaching someone how to code. But most of the time when people are coming to this stream, they're not trying to learn how to code. They just like, my software isn't working right.
Mm-hmm.
Or are you aware of some app that would let me blah, blah, blah. You know, like that's the level of information people are looking for. And then I come here and talk about how to build it. I don't know if it exists or not, but if not, you can build it yourself and here's how.
Uh-huh.
And I try to keep that more in mind. It's harder with you here because there's so much value in
Sure.
teaching you the like how it all works. We talk a lot more about therapy.
Mm-hmm.
But the like simpler version of takeaways here is don't try to prevent people from thinking that you're arrogant.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what you do, you will never stop that from happening.
Mm-hmm.
It will happen from time to time, no matter what, because the same things that some people think are humble, other people think are arrogant. There's a term called false humility that's entirely about like someone who's like, you know what, I'm not that smart. Maybe a lot of people interpret that as like, oh, this person is humble. They don't think highly of themselves. But a lot of people are going to interpret that as like,
I like learning about how to code.
yeah, well, and that's part of the reason that you come back, right? Like, people who don't look to learn how to code are not going to be coming back to this stream right now. Which is, again, not only you, but you that like, I'm incentivized to do the things that the people I'm talking to are interested in. And this is what you all are interested in. And you're asking these questions. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just trying to describe what it is that's happening. Anyway, if you say I'm not that smart, some people might interpret that as, wow, this person's really humble, which increases their opinion of you. But then A, you just did something in order to try and increase other people's opinion of you, which is the opposite of being humble.
It's all a mess.
B, sometimes people will knowingly interpret it the following way, but sometimes people will interpret it this way without knowing it. Is that a person who actually is worried that they are dumb does not go around saying, you know, I'm not that smart. Because being seen as dumb is a bad thing. If someone thinks you're dumb in our culture, that makes them less likely to listen to you, less likely to value the things that you're asking for. Like, it's just bad for a person to think you're dumb in our culture. So it's not something that you would try to convince people of if you were worried that they might actually believe it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, it's, if anyone's like, no, really, I don't understand that much. I'm not smart. I'm dumb. Then the vast majority of the time, you know right away, like, okay, this person is not only smart, they're so smart that no one has ever thought that they were dumb. And therefore they're not worried about, like,
it's like when I use the word transitive property and someone's like, oh, wow, you are really smart. I'm like, but did I use it the right way? And they're like, I don't know. And I was like, I don't know either.
Which goes into so many things about how we associate using certain kinds of language with being intelligent and what the hell do we mean with intelligence? And it's all this stuff. But yeah, there is no way to intentionally be humble. There's only ways to trick people into thinking that you're humble, which I'm phrasing it that way, even though that's a mean way to phrase it. You're not trying to trick or deceive people. You are trying to be humble. Again, you're doing what people have taught you to do.
Right.
Which is just another version of trying to do what people want you to do, which is great because there's no other option. The only choices are about like which people are influencing what you're trying to do and what it is that they're doing and saying. But you're always going to be trying to do what everything you're going to try to do is something that somebody has told you would be worth trying to do. You come up with your own variations and innovative strategies and approaches and come up with your own conclusions, but all built on what other people have told you is good. I don't know why everyone thinks that's so bad. Like that's just intrinsic to being human.
Yeah.
You cannot be a thinking, sentient being without that.
This is quality content, Brandon.
Is it? I wonder. I enjoy it. I've enjoyed being here. We should wrap up. That's a good button. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Vast Insider. Thank you, Dad, my dad, for the comment earlier. I'm going to be with you all. We'll be here next week.
See
Same
you.
time.
Bye.
Bye.